It began with a warning. Almost nobody paid attention to a warning written not in the Declaration of Independence, not in the Constitution, but in the private letters and midnight conversations of the men who built the country. They had just broken free from a king who taxed their tea, stamped their documents, and sent soldiers into their streets. Yet when they finally sat down to create a new nation, that king wasn't what kept them awake at night. What terrified them was something quieter, something that didn't need an army or warships or redcoats marching in formation. They feared a power that could take a nation's freedom without firing a single shot, control over its money. Thomas Jefferson wrote it like a prophecy, almost painfully clear. In an 1816 letter, he warned, "I sincerely believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies." This wasn't dramatic flair. Jefferson genuinely believed that if America was ever conquered again, it wouldn't be by a foreign empire, it would be by a financial one. James Madison, the man who helped design the Constitution, saw it the same way. In 1792, he wrote that the stock jobbers, the early version of Wall Street speculators, had already gained an influence inconceivable over the government. He wasn't talking about enemies from overseas. He was talking about Americans who discovered that money, once centralized, could bend a republic to its knees. The founders had just escaped one form of control. They sensed another one forming in real time. John Adams, the second president, warned that if financial power ever became concentrated, it would create a republic only in name. Adams believed a nation could keep its elections, its courts, its flag, its patriotic speeches, and still lose its freedom if the money system fell into the hands of a few. And then there was Andrew Jackson, loud, stubborn, and absolutely convinced that private banking power was America's real enemy. In 1832, he delivered a famous blast against the Second Bank of the United States, telling Congress, "It is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes." Jackson didn't just say it, he acted on it. He killed the central bank of his time because he believed letting a small group control the nation's money was the fastest path back to monarchy. More than a century later, long after the founders were gone, another president quietly confirmed what they feared. In 1971, Richard Nixon stood before the American people and announced the closing of the gold window, ending the last connection between the dollar and something real. He said, "I am determined that the dollar must never again be a hostage in the hands of international speculators." But everyone understood what it really meant. For the first time in American history, money would be whatever the government said it was, paper backed by nothing but trust. The Founding Fathers had predicted this moment with almost uncomfortable accuracy. They warned that the greatest threat to freedom would come disguised as stability, a money system so centralized, so powerful, and so complex that ordinary people wouldn't notice it tightening around them. And here we are, 2 centuries later, living inside the very system they feared. A system they begged future generations to watch closely. A system they hoped we would question. The real twist is this. Their warning wasn't hidden in dusty archives or secret vaults. It was written in plain English. We just stopped reading it. They weren't paranoid, they were paying attention. The Founding Fathers didn't wake up hating banks for no reason. They had spent years watching how the British Empire quietly ran the world, not with muskets or soldiers, but with a balance sheet. By the mid-1700s, the Bank of England had mastered something terrifying. The power to create money out of thin air and lend it to the government with interest. That meant every war, every colony, every ship crossing the Atlantic was being financed by debt. And that debt gave the bankers more influence than the king himself. To Jefferson, Madison, and Adams, this wasn't theory. They had lived through the results. They saw how Britain's national debt exploded from about £16 million in 1697 to more than £130 million by the end of the 7 Years' War, a level that would have crushed any normal country. Yet Britain didn't collapse, it grew stronger. Why? Because the Bank of England had discovered the trick. If you control the money, you control the empire. This was a revelation that terrified America's early leaders. If a nation could be ruled through debt, then political freedom didn't matter. A country could have elections, speeches, and a constitution and still be financially owned. Inflation was another weapon. During the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress printed so much paper money, the Continental, that it became practically worthless. The phrase "not worth a continental" was born. Washington wrote in frustration that the collapsing currency had done more mischief than the enemy's arms. They learned firsthand that when someone manipulates your money supply, they don't need to invade. They can break you economically. By the time America won its independence, the founders understood the real danger wasn't taxes or tyrants. It was the quiet power to inflate, lend, and control credit. They had watched Britain use it. They had suffered under it. And they knew that if America ever allowed the same system to take root, the country would eventually lose the very freedom it fought for. In their eyes, banking wasn't a business. It was a weapon, and the fuse was already lit. It was the first real showdown of the new nation, a quiet civil war fought not on battlefields, but in letters, arguments, and late-night debates inside cramped Philadelphia rooms that still smelled like wet ink and candle smoke. Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson wanted the same thing, a strong America, but they believed in two completely different paths to get there. And the question that split them wasn't about guns or taxes or treaties, it was about a central bank. Hamilton believed a national bank was the engine that would power the country into the future. He argued that the government needed a place to manage its debt, stabilize the currency, and build credit. To him, finance was strength. He wrote that a national bank would unite the interests of the moneyed and the industrious, creating a stable foundation for the young republic. Jefferson read those words and felt a chill. He didn't just disagree, he saw danger. A central bank, to him, was the first step toward recreating the very system they had fought a war to escape. In 1791, when Hamilton proposed the Bank of the United States, Jefferson warned that such a power places us under the despotism of an aristocracy. Later, he said that letting private financiers control national money would end in the destruction of liberty. This wasn't just a disagreement. It split the country into two camps and formed America's first political parties. Hamilton's supporters became the Federalists, believers in centralized authority and financial power. Jefferson's followers became the Democratic Republicans, defenders of small government and decentralized money. The irony is that both men were right and both were wrong. Hamilton's vision helped America grow. Jefferson's fear predicted the future, because the argument they started never ended. It's the same fight we're having in 2025, the same tug of war between centralized finance and individual freedom. Back then, the debate was over millions. Today, it's over trillions. The numbers have grown, the stakes have exploded, but the question remains exactly the same. Who should control the nation's money, the people, or the system built to manage it? Hamilton and Jefferson aren't just figures in a textbook. They are the two voices still arguing inside every financial crisis we face. When Congress approved the first Bank of the United States in 1791, it felt like the country took its first step into a future Jefferson had begged them to avoid. The ink on the Constitution was barely dry. Yet the new nation had already chosen Hamilton's path, a central bank with the power to create credit, influence markets, and shape the economy. To many politicians, it sounded smart, modern, and necessary. To others, it felt like the moment America forgot its own warning. And almost immediately, the things the founders feared began to unfold. Speculators rushed in. Stock in the new bank skyrocketed before it even opened its doors. A frenzy hit Philadelphia and New York as investors borrowed money just to buy more shares, a cycle that looked suspiciously like the margin-fueled bubbles we talk about today. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson wrote that the entire scheme was designed to swindle futurity on a large scale, convinced that the bank was already turning money into a game for the elite. By 1792, the bubble burst. Markets crashed. Panic spread. Treasury bonds collapsed in value, and the country faced what historians now call America's first financial crisis. Hamilton scrambled to stabilize the system, quietly buying government securities to stop the fall, an early version of a bailout. That rescue, though small by today's standards, foreshadowed every intervention the Federal Reserve would later make centuries later. But the trouble didn't end there. After the first bank's charter expired in 1811, Congress attempted to live without a central bank. Within a few years, the War of 1812 hit, inflation surged, and the government couldn't fund itself. In desperation, lawmakers brought the system back in 1816 with the Second Bank of the United States, another institution with enormous power to expand credit, influence politics, and steer the economy. The cycle repeated almost instantly. Easy credit led to land speculation. Land speculation turned into mania, mania turned into collapse. The Panic of 1819 arrived America's first true economic depression, complete with foreclosures, bank failures, unemployment, and public anger. James Monroe called it a distress which no nation had ever felt before. The pattern was already visible. Create centralized credit, spark a boom, trigger a bust, repeat. What happened in the 1790s and 1810s wasn't ancient history. It was the blueprint for every crash that followed. The founders hadn't been dramatic. They had been early witnesses to a cycle the nation would spend the next 200 years reliving. By the time the Second Bank of the United States opened its doors in 1816, the country had already forgotten the bruises left by the first experiment. Congress believed a stronger, bigger central bank would bring order. Instead, it brought the exact nightmare Jefferson had described years earlier. The moment the bank began expanding credit, it lit a fuse beneath the entire economy. At first, everything felt perfect. Loans were easy, land was cheap, farmers, merchants, and frontier settlers borrowed money believing prosperity was guaranteed. Newspapers called it the era of good feelings. But underneath the optimism was a dangerous truth. The country was growing on borrowed money, not real wealth. The second bank pumped out credit faster than anyone could track, and speculators used that money to drive land prices to absurd heights, a bubble that looked painfully similar to the housing mania before 2008 or the asset inflation of 2020. Then came the snap. In 1818, the bank suddenly reversed course. It tightened lending, demanded repayment, and tried to control inflation it had helped create. The effect was brutal and immediate. Land values collapsed, banks failed, ordinary people lost everything. The Panic of 1819 wasn't just a dip in the market, it was America's first real recession. Unemployment soared. Families were evicted. Farmers watched their land vanish into the hands of creditors. A young Abraham Lincoln later said that hearing his father talk about the panic was like listening to a storm that never ended. For regular Americans, this was the moment the founders' warnings stopped sounding theoretical. When Jefferson wrote that banking power would make slaves of the people, he wasn't imagining chains. He meant debt. And in 1819, the country learned exactly what that looked like. 200 years later, the pattern hasn't changed. The names are different: subprime mortgages in 2008, stimulus-fueled asset bubbles in 2020, and a debt system in 2025 held together with interest-only payments and hope, but the mechanics are identical. Easy credit, inflated markets, sudden tightening, collapse. The Panic of 1819 was the first time America fell into this cycle. It would not be the last. In many ways, we're still living inside the same story, only now the numbers are bigger, the crashes hit faster, and the consequences reach everyone. Andrew Jackson had fought in duels, survived bullet wounds, and stared down armies, yet nothing made his blood boil like the Second Bank of the United States. To Jackson, the bank wasn't just a building or an institution. It was a threat to the very soul of the Republic. He said it plainly, almost like he was daring history to quote him forever. The bank was more dangerous than a standing army. Jackson believed that any power capable of creating money, shaping credit, and influencing politicians could quietly conquer the nation from the inside. And unlike many presidents, he wasn't afraid to pick a fight. The moment he entered the White House in 1829, he declared war not on a foreign enemy, but on a financial machine he believed was eating the country from the inside out. The head of the bank, Nicholas Biddle, was brilliant, wealthy, and completely convinced he knew what was best for America. He tightened and loosened credit, like pulling a lever, and politicians from both parties quietly admitted that crossing him was political suicide. Jackson saw all of this and felt his worst fears confirmed. In his 1832 veto message, he wrote that the bank enjoys an exclusive privilege, a monopoly of the foreign and domestic exchange, warning that such power could create a permanent aristocracy of wealth. The clash between Jackson and Biddle became known as the Bank War, a battle of letters, speeches, and financial pressure that split Congress and the country. When Jackson vetoed the bank's recharter, he didn't whisper. He thundered that the institution was a monster created to favor the rich at the expense of ordinary citizens. Crowds cheered, newspapers exploded, and for the first time in its history, America had a president who was willing to tear down the financial system instead of bowing to it. Jackson won. In 1836, the second bank died. Federal deposits were removed. The central financial power the founders feared was gone, at least for a moment. And for a short time, the country tasted something rare, a money system not controlled by a single institution. Jackson had delivered the closest thing to the freedom Jefferson imagined. But he also knew what everyone else refused to admit: destroying the bank didn't erase the underlying problem. It only bought time. Because the country's appetite for credit didn't disappear. Its addiction to easy money didn't vanish, and the forces that created the first banks were already waiting for their chance to rise again. Jackson won the war, but the system he fought was already planning its return. By the time 1913 arrived, the warning the founding fathers left behind was no longer a theory. It was about to become the operating system of the United States. On a cold December night, while most Americans were preparing for Christmas, Congress quietly passed the Federal Reserve Act. President Woodrow Wilson signed it, later admitting he had unwittingly ruined my country. And in that moment, the very system Jefferson, Madison, and Adams feared stepped into place. For the first time since Jackson killed the second bank, America once again had a central bank, but this one was even more powerful. It wasn't fully government-run, and it wasn't fully private. It was a strange hybrid, a network of regional banks controlled by private bankers, overseen by a board, appointed by politicians, all wrapped in an intentionally confusing structure. The founders had warned that if financial power ever became centralized and privately influenced, liberty wouldn't die by force, it would die quietly. And with the creation of the Federal Reserve, that prediction became real. The Federal Reserve now had the ability to create money with a pen stroke, expand credit endlessly, and control interest rates, the heartbeat of the entire economy. It could cause booms by flooding markets with cheap money, or cause crashes by tightening it. This wasn't conspiracy. It was written directly into its mandate. Within just 2 decades, the founders' fears played out on a scale no one imagined. The Fed's policies in the 1920s helped inflate the bubble that burst into the Great Depression. Milton Friedman later said, "The Great Depression was produced by the failure of the Federal Reserve." 1 century later, the same dynamics fueled the 2008 housing collapse, cheap credit, reckless lending, and a system designed to save itself at any cost. And now, in 2025, the result is a $34 trillion national debt, the biggest asset bubbles in history, and a financial system that runs on constant intervention. America wasn't conquered by a king or an army, it was conquered by the exact thing the founders feared: a centralized money power operating behind the scenes, steering the nation with levers ordinary people never see. The prophecy they tried to warn us about didn't just come true. We're living inside it. They tried to warn us. Not in riddles, not in hidden codes, but in plain, blunt language. Jefferson, Madison, Adams, they all feared the same ending. Not a dictator rising from the shadows, not foreign armies marching across American soil, but a slow, quiet transfer of power from the people to the money. Jefferson wrote that if private banking power ever controlled the currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the result would be a nation robbed of its own future. Madison warned that the tools of finance, debt, credit, and interest could one day endanger the liberties of our country more than the enemy's arms. These were not dramatic lines in a movie. They were predictions from men who had already watched an empire fall to the same forces. 200 years later, it's hard not to feel the weight of those words. We don't live under a king, but we do live under a system powered by debt. A system where the government borrows more than it earns. A system where inflation quietly eats away at people's savings. A system where credit can lift an economy up or pull it down overnight. A system where the institutions that create the money also decide its price. This isn't tyranny in the way the founders knew it. It's softer, quieter, more polite. It shows up in rising prices, impossible mortgages, student loans that never shrink, and national debt numbers so large they barely feel real. It's a form of control that doesn't need force. It just needs people not to understand how it works. And that's the final warning the founders left for us. A republic survives only when its citizens learn the system that governs them, when they stop assuming the money is neutral, when they stop believing debt is just how things are, when they start questioning the machinery behind every boom, every bust, every wave of inflation. So the question we're left with is simple. Are we living through the decline Jefferson and Madison saw coming? Or is this the moment when ordinary people finally wake up to how the system really works? Because the truth is this, you don't have to overthrow a system to escape its control. You just have to understand it. Knowledge won't erase debt, but it will keep the system from writing your story for you.